So today I want to revisit the M2 MacBook Air in late 2024 because Apple surprised us by upgrading the RAM in all their existing Macs, and so 16 gigs is now the default RAM configuration, and that really makes the $999 M2 base model insane value. So let's actually begin with the performance, because I feel like when this MacBook came out there was a huge fuss about thermal throttling issues and it overheating, but that's not really the case. I have been pushing this MacBook by editing videos and making thumbnails on a daily basis, and not once did this Mac struggle. Now yes, you could argue my content looks pretty basic, but this is still a lot more intensive work for a MacBook Air than of course what most regular folks are going to do with these machines, and so the fact I've had zero performance issues should tell you this is going to be plenty powerful for most. Please do not worry about this being fanless. I also had zero problems with the M1 MacBook Air, and I've had that since launch, which was 4 years ago. So yes, Apple Silicon honestly works like magic. Especially for someone who's a student and you're typing up documents and watching videos, then you should not worry one bit. The base M2 MacBook Air is completely fine. Now I know people are going to bring up the slower SSD the M2 model has, and don't get me wrong, it does suck that Apple did downgrade the SSD in these M2 models, but at the same time, most probably won't notice this. Not everything on paper translates into real life usage, because my M1 Air with the faster SSD did not feel like a much faster experience than the M2 Air. In fact, they perform about the same for my workflow, despite the slower SSD in the M2. But let's get into the big news, which is 16 gigs of RAM being the standard option now. To be honest, when it came to the previous standard of 8 gigs, I didn't have many issues surprisingly, and memory swap was working just fine, but of course for longevity alone, having more RAM is beneficial, and so I'm glad to see 16 gigs is now the default. Apple, by the way, is giving us this upgrade because Apple Intelligence requires more RAM, so I guess there are benefits to AI being shoved down our throats. And another plus with 16 gigs being the standard now is that no longer do you have to decide if you want to upgrade the RAM or storage. I think 16 gigs is plenty enough for most consumers, and so don't bother with the 24 gig RAM option, just get more storage if you need it, though of course you can always use external storage because Apple does charge an arm and a leg quite literally for those storage upgrades. Let's now move on to the design, and I must admit guys, I was wrong to quickly dismiss the new design language that was introduced to the MacBook Air with the M2 refresh. I was pretty salty about the lack of a wedge, but only after interacting with this Mac in person, I've actually come to appreciate the much thinner chassis. I also do like the softer corners because the M1 Air and basically all of the 2016 era MacBooks have very sharp corners that are easy to scratch and dent, and that's no longer the case with this new design. You know what else I'd love to see? If you subscribe to the channel, of course. It's free and would bring you the latest about Apple right to your subscription box, so please consider it. It would be appreciated. Join the saranbyte gang now. Anyways, the M2, like the M3 model, does come in 4 color choices, and whilst everyone's still going to go gaga for the midnight, I much prefer the classic silver, and overall it's still pretty crazy that a 2-year-old design feels this fresh. I mean, there was a reason they recycled the same design with the M3 model, and that's because this still looks pretty modern. Now moving on to the display, this essentially has the same panel that Apple's been using on MacBooks for years. In fact, apart from the notch, which by the way has never bothered me, and also the high brightness, which I don't particularly care about, this is the same LCD panel the M1 MacBook Air has, as well as pretty much every MacBook since 2015. That might sound like a bad thing, but because Apple nailed the displays on their Macs early on, this is still a great panel. Yes, it lacks some of the fancy features like mini LED and 120Hz that the pros offer, but I can still personally look past those, and I still enjoy watching YouTube, movies and TV shows on this machine. Now the M2 MacBook Air has a standard 1080p webcam that does the job for the most part, but I will say you're likely better off using continuity camera because the quality your iPhone produces is frankly much better. Though I will say the newest Mac releases do now have a center stage camera where the camera can follow you around as you move, and so I do expect a future MacBook Air to get this, but again, do remember with continuity camera, you do actually get this feature with your iPhone camera. Audio mic-wise, this Mac is excellent. I've really enjoyed streaming Spotify on this machine with the speakers, and it's crazy how good they sound despite not being front-firing. It's actually tucked behind the hinge, and I've been told by friends I sound crispy and clear with these mics when I do the occasional Discord calls, so here's a sample for you guys. And here's a webcam test for you guys. I should sound pretty good. The visuals should be decent enough. So yeah, let me know how this is. The keyboard is also fantastic. I know some have mentioned the keys feel mushier compared to the M1 model, but that's not been the case for me. They're still solid, and oh my god, is the trackpad perfection. Every time I use the Mac, I come to appreciate how good Apple's trackpads are, because When I used to use Windows laptops, those all had terrible trackpads, and it seems Apple's really the only manufacturer who can nail this part of the experience. Touch ID has also been reliable, and the ports on this have actually been a game changer for me because we have MagSafe. Now, it's actually not to do with the fast charging or the fact it gives you a satisfying magnetic connection, but it's more to do with the fact I now essentially have an additional port. You see, with the older M1 MacBook Air, I would have to use one port for charging, and so to connect peripherals to the Mac, they only had access to one port, which was mildly frustrating. Now, though, I have two ports, which are free when charging, which I do greatly appreciate. The battery life is also something I greatly appreciate. Back when I got this MacBook, it would only drop from 100% to 87% when editing for 2 hours, which is just incredible. For reference, my Intel MacBook Pro would be close to dead once I finish editing for 2 hours, and so this is easily the best thing about Apple Silicon Macs. They last forever, guys, and the battery life should impress everyone. Though do know I said back then because obviously after long-term usage the battery health has dropped a little, but it still does easily get me through a day, and I found my M1 MacBook Air that's even older has also been fine for long-term usage, so you shouldn't worry about the battery life getting considerably worse after a few years of use. So those are basically all my thoughts regarding the M2 MacBook Air. Now, for those wondering about the longevity of the M2 chipset, do remember the iPad Air this year got updated with the M2 chipset, and yes, it might not be based on a fancy new 3nm process and might not have ray tracing support, but it's still a great chipset, and I expect at least 7 or 8 more years of support. And so overall, guys, I would highly recommend you buy this. It's not the most exciting product in the world, but it's solid, and there's a lot to like here, like the design, the performance, and also the fact it now comes with 16 gigs of RAM as standards. This MacBook really nails the basics of what makes a great computer. And what's even better is that the M3 Air that Apple released earlier this year is basically the same, if I'm being honest, guys. It has a new chipset that's slightly better. It supports 2 external displays instead of 1, but that's with the lid closed, so it's not that much of an advantage. And also the SSD's faster and the midnight color is more fingerprint resistant. Now, I know some of you guys might be thinking, hey, those small changes do add up and make the $100 premium for the M3 worth it, right? Well, yes, if you do exclusively shop through Apple, you could justify the additional cost, but remember, if you shop elsewhere, the M2 has come down in price. I've seen the M2 Air go for as low as $849 in the US, and it can be found for even less if you're willing to go refurbished. Personally, I would consider Apple refurbished because their refurb products are basically brand new, and I'll leave a link to my video regarding that in the iCard above. But even here in the UK, I've seen a lot of deals on the M2 Air, and it's a no-brainer to go for the older Mac that's 95% identical to the brand new M3. I'll leave links to buy this machine below. Anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comments, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this, and thank you for watching. So I've been using the new iPad mini 7 for a little while, and I'm ready to give you guys my thoughts on this.